Now let's go to Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She joins us again from Washington, D.C. You've been listening in to those various statements. I have to put to you again what I put to Gabe. Gabe taking away that what we heard there from the U.S. Interim Ambassador Dorothy Shear was quite significant, that she was not able to defend Israel. The U.S. was not able to defend Israel, essentially, and that Israel has now lost its main ally, at least when it comes to this attack on Qatar. Would you agree with that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I wish I could agree with that. But I think what we're actually seeing here is that the U.S. will continue to prevent the Security Council from acting to hold Israel accountable. Whether or not the U.S. was pleased about the decision by the Israelis to launch this assassination effort in Qatar as opposed to some other country, as it has done in the past, we don't know exactly. We don't know who knew what when. When did Trump know it? When did the Secretary of Defense know it? When did the Secretary of State know it? What we do know is, regardless of who knew what when, the U.S. has enabled this by providing the money and the weapons to make it possible. Unless the U.S. is prepared to allow the Security Council to act, to impose an arms embargo and abide by that arms embargo, to impose sanctions and abide by those sanctions, and to stop protecting Israel in the United Nations and other international arenas, then its protection doesn't really end. Its real protection doesn't really end. So I'm afraid that the notion that because they're not enthusiastically defending the specific Israeli action, or at least not all of it, they did say that it was a worthy goal to attack Hamas, besides sort of ignoring the fact that it has only been through negotiations, not through the Israeli genocide going on, only through negotiations have large numbers of the hostages been released. That's the only thing that has worked. And despite that, they're saying that it's still a worthy goal to go after Hamas, and in this case, to go after the Hamas negotiators. Israel has a long history of assassinating negotiators to prevent the negotiations from succeeding. The U.S. says we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. That implies they could have prevented it in the first place. What are they going to do in the future in the effort that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said will be coming, that there will be future efforts just like this? Trump says he wants the hostages released, and he says that can happen if Hamas, quote, disarms and surrenders. When you claim that you're trying to negotiate between two parties, to say that the only way the genocide against one of them is going to end is if the other side surrenders, that's not diplomacy. That's the abandonment of diplomacy and the reliance on genocide as an instrument of policy. That's what we're seeing here.
So, Phyllis, where do we go from here? We heard a number of country representatives talking there about returning back to the negotiating. What is the likelihood of that happening? Is Qatar in a tricky position here? Because it has been taking a key role, but it's obviously come at a risk.
Absolutely. I think it would be very difficult for Qatar to go back, certainly to go back soon into negotiating in this situation where it cannot defend even itself, let alone defend the negotiating teams that are working there. You know, Israel sends negotiating teams that are generally led by Mossad officials, intelligence officials, and they go to Qatar with the guarantee by Qatar that they will protect those Israeli leaders who may have a lot to do with the genocide that's going on, who may have committed war crimes. We don't know. But when they cannot protect the Palestinian side and they cannot protect themselves because the U.S. has provided the arms and the money to enable these attacks, then I think Qatar is in a very difficult position. I think what's necessary now in terms of the Security Council is to move back to the question of what can the Council do to end this genocide. That's at the root of this. The most recent attack against Qatar was the most recent, but we have been talking about genocide now for almost 2 years. Statements of the Security Council are worthless unless there is action included. That means they have to figure out a way to either get the US on board, which is very, very difficult, or more likely force the US to use its veto in the eyes of the world to make another 14-1 decision, which will then go back to the General Assembly, which can enforce using the criteria of the Uniting for Peace precedent as it did last year. The General Assembly can go further with this once there is another veto in the Security Council to impose an arms embargo that works by every country, to protect the humanitarian aid access that is so urgently needed, to impose a ceasefire. Those actions can be taken by the Council. If the US vetoes that effort, then it can go directly to the General Assembly under the terms of Uniting for Peace, which allow the General Assembly, the most democratic component of the United Nations, as opposed to the Council, which has the power but is the least democratic. And the General Assembly can then take up issues of peace and security that ordinarily belong only to the Council when the Council is paralyzed by the veto of one of the permanent members. It can then move to enforce these things. It has not done that yet. Pressure needs to come to all countries, all governments, all members of the General Assembly to figure out ways of implementing the very important resolution that was passed a year ago. There is an example that we know works, the example of the South African anti-apartheid effort in the 1980s, when again, efforts to impose an arms embargo, efforts to impose sanctions were brought to the Security Council. The United States and often Britain vetoed over and over again for years. And eventually it went back to the General Assembly, which created the Committee Against Apartheid, the Center Against Apartheid, to provide a staff to carry out that work, to move to restrict the South African apartheid government's access to the United Nations. The General Assembly can do all of that again, but it takes the political will of all of these other countries to be prepared to do that in the face of massive opposition and threats from the United States. That's the challenge. That's the serious challenge. Without that, the arguments over what language goes into a resolution or a statement that has no enforcement intention really doesn't matter very much.
OK, Phyllis, we're going to leave it there for now. We will come back to you later on in the programme. If you are just joining us, we have been